Manitowoc County, Wisconsin, 1849. While every settler raced to build separate cabins and barns before winter, German immigrant Gottlieb Lutz was still framing one massive structure in late fall. His neighbors called it backwards. They called him a fool. He built a 72-foot-long building that looked like a barn from the road, but half of it housed his family. One roof covered people and livestock. Interior doors connected living quarters to the stable, so chores never required stepping outside. He spent 2 seasons on what others finished in months, hand-hewing posts and filling timber walls with clay. Then February 1881 arrived. Rain turned to snow on the 26th. 2 blizzards followed in 7 days. Drifts piled 10 to 16 feet high across Wisconsin. Roads vanished. Trains stopped dead for days. Standard homesteads turned into frozen traps. Neighbors could hear their animals but couldn't reach them without digging trenches that refilled behind them. But that fool's house barn? Lutz opened an interior door and walked to his livestock with the wind shut out completely. What did this immigrant understand about winter logistics that born Americans missed? And why did his excessive preparation mean he never had to shovel his way to survival? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The wind that Saturday morning in February 1881 carried the scent of coming snow. But Johann Gottlieb Lutze barely noticed as he moved through his morning routine. Inside the massive timber structure that had earned him 3 decades of ridicule, he opened an interior door and stepped directly into the livestock area without his coat. The air was still and workable, warmed by the heat of 6 dairy cows and insulated by the clay-filled walls that stretched 72 feet and 9 inches from end to end. Outside, his neighbor Jacob Miller was already bundling into wool and leather, preparing for the daily trek to his separate barn, a walk that would prove deadly before the week ended. The contrast had been building since 1849, when the Lutze family first arrived from the province of Saxony with their children and $80 to spare after purchasing 80 acres for $105. Gottlieb brought with him the old country knowledge of the Wohnstall house, the dwelling stable that had sheltered German farmers through centuries of harsh winters. But in Wisconsin, where American settlers prized the separation of human and animal spaces, his design looked like madness. The footprint alone violated every convention, a single massive rectangle oriented to deflect prevailing winds, with living quarters occupying one end and livestock the other, all under the protection of a common roof system. While his neighbors threw up quick log cabins and planned to add barns later, Gottlieb spent his first 2 years creating something that looked backwards to American eyes. The foundation required careful placement of stone piers to lift the heavy sills off Wisconsin's wet ground. The frame demanded hand-hewn posts and beams with proper braced bays, timberwork that could resist the racking forces of prairie wind. Between the massive timbers, he packed clay nogging, adapting the half-timber fachwerk tradition to local materials. The result was a structure that read like one long barn from the township road, but contained a warm, human-sized living space protected within a much larger working shell. The mockery was relentless and specific. "You built a barn first and forgot the house," became the standard joke at barn raisings and church gatherings. Neighbors questioned every decision, the wasted lumber in such a large roof span, the backwards priorities that put animals and humans under the same timber frame, the excessive time spent on what they saw as primitive European thinking. The township's unofficial barn-raising expert, a carpenter who had helped frame dozens of conventional homesteads, publicly dismissed the project as more work for less sense. He pushed the conventional wisdom hard. Build a modest cabin now, add a separate barn when time and money allowed. The short walk between buildings was nothing to a hardy settler. But Gottlieb understood something about Wisconsin winter that his critics had not yet learned. The dwelling stable was not about comfort, it was about logistics. Every chore that required stepping outside meant exposure to wind, wet, and cold that could kill livestock and exhaust human endurance. His interior doors between living and working areas meant that feeding, watering, and bedding stock could continue regardless of weather conditions. The stable area stayed warmer because it shared wall space with the heated living quarters. Wood and kindling remained dry and accessible. Tools stayed functional instead of freezing to metal. Friederike Lutz, working alongside her husband through those early years, understood the system from the domestic side. Her kitchen connected to a food storage cellar that measured 8 feet by 20 feet, carved directly beneath the living quarters. Cooking, storage, and household work flowed in a protected circuit that never required stepping into killing wind. While neighbor women struggled with frozen wash water and fuel that turned wet and useless, the house barn kept essential materials under shelter and within reach. As that February Saturday progressed in 1881, light rain began falling across Manitowoc County. Gottlieb moved through his evening chores without urgency, accessing livestock and feed through interior passages while the weather shifted outside. Jakob Muller, finishing his own barn work, felt the first ice crystals mixed with rain and hurried back to his cabin across 30 yards of open ground. The walk seemed harmless, a quick dash between buildings that took less than a minute in good weather. By Sunday morning, the rain had turned to snow. Not the gentle flakes of a typical Wisconsin winter, but wind-driven precipitation that began filling the spaces between buildings and piling against every vertical surface. Gottlieb opened his interior door to check the livestock and found them comfortable, their body heat helping to moderate the temperature in the shared airspace. The massive timber frame absorbed and distributed thermal energy, while the clay nogging sealed gaps that would have leaked precious warmth in conventional construction. Muller woke to drifted snow against his cabin door and a barn that might as well have been in the next county. What had been a simple walk was now a trench that needed constant clearing, and the wind refilled his path as fast as he could shovel. Each trip to feed and water his animals became a battle that left him exhausted and half frozen. The separate buildings that represented proper American farm layout had become a trap. By Tuesday, 2 more blizzards had rolled across the region in rapid succession. Snow depths reached 10 to 16 feet in places, with wind-sculpted drifts that stretched 100 to 200 feet and blocked roads completely. Rail traffic stopped dead between cities. The storm that would be remembered as the Big Snow of '81 was testing every piece of frontier infrastructure, and the conventional wisdom about farm layout was failing catastrophically. Inside the house barn, the Lutze family maintained their routines. Gottlieb could tend livestock, split wood, and manage essential repairs without stepping into the killing wind. The interior doors that had seemed like an eccentric waste of space now revealed their purpose. While neighbors struggled to keep animals alive and themselves fed, the dwelling stable functioned as it had been designed to function, a complete farm operation protected within a single windproof envelope. The mockery was about to become vindication, measured in lives saved and work that continued when everyone else was trapped. The criticism that followed Gottlieb Lutz's construction project cut deeper than casual neighborly teasing. Timber, labor, and time represented the 3 currencies that determined survival on the Wisconsin frontier, and his neighbors watched him spend all 3 on what they considered architectural madness. Jakob Muller, who had helped raise barns across 3 townships, calculated the waste in board feet and man-hours. A sensible homesteader could frame a solid cabin in 3 weeks and throw up a functional barn before the first hard freeze. Lutze had been cutting, hewing, and fitting timber for 2 full seasons while his family lived in temporary shelter. The township's informal council of experienced settlers made their position clear during the autumn. Barn raising for the Zimmerman family in 1850. Build small first, expand smart later, became their mantra. A 12 by 16 cabin could house a family through the worst weather, and a simple 3-sided shelter would keep livestock alive until spring-building weather returned. Why waste hand-hewn posts on empty air when a man could raise practical structures in sequence? The criticism carried weight because these men had survived multiple Wisconsin winters using conventional methods. But Gottlieb carried memory from the old country that his critics lacked. In Saxony, the dwelling stable had evolved through centuries of harsh continental winters, where the difference between integrated and separated farm operations could be measured in dead livestock and exhausted families. The Wohnstall house was not a comfort choice. It was an efficiency machine designed for wet, cold seasons that punished every unnecessary trip outside. Wisconsin's brutal winters would eventually make believers out of skeptics, but the lesson required crisis to teach itself. The construction sequence that puzzled his neighbors followed old country logic adapted to American materials and conditions. Gottlieb began with careful site orientation, positioning the rectangular footprint to deflect prevailing northwest winds while ensuring that doorways would not become snow traps during blizzard conditions. The foundation demanded precise placement of fieldstone piers that would carry the massive sill beams clear of Wisconsin's saturated spring soil. Each pier required careful selection and fitting of stones that could bear the distributed weight of the entire structure without settling or shifting. The timber frame represented the most visible expense that drove neighborhood criticism. Hand-hewn post and beam construction required selecting, felling, and shaping massive oak and elm trees into structural members that could span the full width of the building. Each post was squared with broadaxe and adze sized to carry vertical loads and resist lateral forces from prairie wind. The horizontal beams that connected these posts demanded mortise and tenon joinery that took skilled hands and sharp tools to execute properly. Diagonal braces in each bay provided the racking resistance that kept the frame square under stress. Between the heavy timbers, Gottlieb filled the wall spaces with clay nogging, a half-timber technique called fachwerk that his father had learned in the old country. Local clay mixed with straw and worked into the gaps between structural members created insulated walls that sealed air infiltration while allowing the timber frame to carry all structural loads. The technique adapted European building traditions to Wisconsin materials, using prairie clay instead of the lime mortars common in German construction. The interior layout that seemed wasteful to American eyes followed practical logic that winter would validate. Living quarters occupied the eastern end of the 72-foot structure, with kitchen, sleeping areas, and the 8 by 20-foot root cellar that extended beneath the main floor. The western end housed livestock, 6 dairy cows, workhorses, and essential farm equipment that needed protection from weather. Crucially, interior doors on both the main floor and the loft level connected human and animal spaces without requiring anyone to step outside. The roof system that covered this massive footprint represented another point of criticism from conventional builders. A single continuous roof structure spanning 28 feet and 5 inches required careful engineering of rafters, plates, and ridge beams that could carry snow loads without sagging or breaking. The expense in materials and labor seemed excessive when 2 smaller roofs could cover separated buildings at lower cost and risk. But Gottlieb understood that a single roof eliminated the gaps between buildings where snow could accumulate and block access routes. Interior circulation patterns revealed the dwelling stable's true purpose as winter arrived. From the kitchen, Friederike could access the root cellar for stored vegetables, preserved meat, and dairy products without leaving heated space. Gottlieb could move from the living area to the stable through interior doors that kept wind from washing heat out of either space. Feed, bedding, and tools remained under cover and accessible regardless of snow depth or wind conditions outside. Firewood stayed dry in interior storage areas instead of becoming soaked and unusable in outdoor piles. The thermal dynamics that made the system work became apparent during the first serious cold snap of 1850. Animal body heat from 6 high-producing dairy cows generated significant warmth in the shared airspace, each cow producing roughly 4,500 to 6,000 BTU per hour, according to modern measurements that quantify what pioneers observed through daily experience. The stable area stayed noticeably warmer than outside air, and the shared wall systems allowed some of that heat to moderate temperatures in the living quarters. Air buffer effects provided another advantage that conventional separated buildings could not match. The large volume of the barn area sat between outside weather and the human living space, creating a thermal zone that dulled sudden temperature swings and reduced direct wind exposure on the heated rooms. When blizzards drove snow horizontally across the prairie, the living quarters remained insulated by the buffer space and protected circulation routes. As autumn turned to early winter in 1850, the neighbors' criticism began to carry less conviction. Jakob Miller found himself making multiple trips between cabin and barn during each day's chores, bundling and unbundling against cold that seemed to bite deeper with each exposure. His tools froze to metal. His firewood pile collected snow and ice that made dry kindling harder to split. The short walk that seemed harmless in September required careful planning and warm clothing by December. Inside the dwelling stable, routines continued with mechanical efficiency. Morning chores, evening feeding, equipment maintenance, and wood splitting proceeded on schedule regardless of wind or temperature outside. The integrated design that had seemed like wasteful overbuilding revealed its purpose as a working system that kept essential farm operations functioning when weather shut down conventional layouts. The proof would come with the first real test, but the foundation was already laid in timber, clay, and old country wisdom that American critics were about to learn the hard way. The winter of 1851 tested both methods before the famous blizzard would arrive 30 years later. By December, the daily mathematics of frontier survival had sorted settlers into two categories: those who could maintain their routines regardless of weather, and those who fought the same battles every morning just to keep livestock alive. Jakob Müller discovered that his sensible approach to separated buildings carried costs that no one had calculated in advance. Each dawn brought the same sequence of preparation and exposure. Coat button, boots laced, hat pulled low against wind that cut across the prairie without obstruction. The 30-yard walk to his barn seemed manageable until snow began drifting against the door overnight, requiring him to shovel clear space before he could even enter. Inside the barn, his breath formed clouds in air that stayed only marginally warmer than outside. Tools froze to his hands. Water buckets developed ice that had to be broken before animals could drink. Hay and grain stayed dry enough, but harnesses stiffened and became difficult to work with numb fingers. The return trip to his cabin meant reversing the process, securing the barn, bundling against wind, and crossing ground that accumulated more snow each day. By the time he reached his kitchen, Müller was half frozen and exhausted before breakfast. The process repeated at evening feeding time, and again whenever maintenance or emergency care required attention. What had seemed like a brief walk in autumn had become a daily ordeal that consumed energy and time he could not spare. Inside the house barn, Gottlieb moved through the same essential tasks with mechanical efficiency. Interior doors eliminated the coat-on, coat-off cycle that drained heat from his body and wasted time with bundling and unbundling. He opened a door from the kitchen area and stepped directly into the stable space where 6 dairy cows provided ambient heat that moderated the interior temperature. Their collective body heat, generating thousands of BTU per hour, created a working environment that stayed 20 to 30 degrees warmer than outside air. The thermal dynamics worked through simple physics that required no sophisticated engineering to achieve. Wind represented the primary thief of body heat and building warmth, washing heated air away from surfaces and driving cold infiltration through every crack and gap. The house barn's single envelope eliminated wind exposure during essential work, while the large interior volume buffered temperature swings that made conventional barns unbearable during extreme weather. Animal heat mixed with residual warmth from the living quarters created a stable thermal environment where hands stayed functional and tools remained workable. Fuel efficiency emerged as another advantage that winter made measurable. Northern Wisconsin homesteads typically consumed 10 to 15 cords of wood per year to maintain livable temperatures in conventional cabin construction. Inefficient open fires and poorly sealed buildings demanded constant feeding with hand-split fuel that required enormous labor to cut, haul, and prepare. The house barn reduced this waste through multiple mechanisms: less heat loss to wind during door opening cycles, reduced infiltration through shared wall systems, and the thermal contribution of animal body heat that supplemented wood burning. Dry storage represented a survival factor that separated buildings could not provide effectively. Müller's wood pile, stacked outside his cabin, collected snow and ice that made kindling difficult to split and slow to ignite. His tools, left in the barn overnight, required warming before they could be used effectively. Harnesses and leather goods stiffened in unheated spaces, making routine work more difficult and time-consuming. The dwelling stable kept essential materials accessible and functional. Firewood remained dry in interior storage areas where snow could not reach it. Tools stayed at workable temperatures in the stable area, where animal heat prevented metal from reaching the bitter extremes that made equipment painful to handle. Feed and bedding stored under the common roof eliminated the need for exterior trips to supply sheds that might become inaccessible during severe weather. Work continuity became the decisive factor that distinguished the two approaches. Muller found his daily schedule increasingly dominated by weather considerations. Storm days meant interrupted routines, emergency conditions that required heroic efforts just to maintain basic care for livestock. Equipment failures during severe weather could cascade into serious problems because repairs required tools and materials that might be trapped in separate buildings. A broken harness or damaged stall door became major crises when reaching the necessary supplies meant battling through drifted snow and killing wind. Inside the integrated system, routine maintenance and daily operations continued regardless of conditions outside. Gottlieb could repair equipment, adjust feed rations, and address problems as they arose without the tactical planning required for each trip outside. The stable area provided a workshop environment where essential farm work proceeded on schedule instead of being postponed until weather permitted. This continuity prevented the accumulation of small problems that could compound into larger crises during extended periods of severe weather. The human endurance factor revealed itself through cumulative effects rather than single dramatic failures. Muller's daily exposure to extreme cold demanded physical reserves that left him increasingly exhausted as winter progressed. The energy cost of maintaining body temperature during repeated trips outside, combined with the stress of working with numb hands and frozen tools, created a cycle of depletion that made every task more difficult. By February, the simple act of feeding livestock had become a test of will rather than routine work. Friederike Lutze managed household operations with the same protected efficiency that characterized the livestock care. Her kitchen connected to the root cellar through interior, access that kept preserved foods at stable temperatures and prevented the freeze-thaw cycles that destroyed stored vegetables. Cooking, cleaning, and food preparation proceeded in heated spaces that remained functional regardless of outside conditions. She could process milk from the cows, prepare meals, and manage household work in an integrated system that eliminated the exposure and inefficiency that plagued separated operations. As winter deepened toward the memorable storm of 1881, the fundamental difference between the two approaches became undeniable. One system allowed its operators to maintain normal routines while weather raged outside. The other turned every essential task into a battle against elements that grew more severe with each passing storm. The house barn was not just sheltering livestock and supplies. It was preserving human energy and maintaining operational capacity that conventional homesteads were losing with each blizzard. The light rain that began falling across Manitowoc County on Saturday morning, February 26, 1881, carried no warning of what was coming. C.T. Wettstein, boarding the morning train from Port Washington to Milwaukee, noted the mild weather in his diary as the locomotive pulled away from the station. Within hours, that same precipitation would transform into the meteorological disaster that would paralyze Wisconsin and test every piece of frontier infrastructure built over the previous 3 decades. By midday Saturday, the rain had turned to wet snow that clung to telegraph wires and began accumulating on roads throughout the region. Jakob Muller, checking his livestock during the afternoon feeding, felt the temperature dropping and the wind picking up from the northwest. The transition seemed gradual at first: heavier precipitation, colder air, snow beginning to stick instead of melting on contact. But the atmospheric machinery building over the upper Midwest was assembling forces that would shut down an entire state for the better part of a week. Sunday brought the first serious accumulation as snow fell steadily through the night and into Monday morning. Muller woke to find his cabin door blocked by a drift that required shoveling before he could step outside. The familiar 30-yard path to his barn had disappeared beneath white that shifted and moved with each gust of wind. What had been a simple walk now required tactical planning: dress warmly, carry a shovel, dig out the barn door, and hope the wind did not refill the path before evening chores. Inside the house barn, Gottlieb Lutze moved through his morning routine with the mechanical efficiency that 30 years of the dwelling stable system had refined. The interior door between living quarters and livestock area opened onto a space that remained workably warm despite the storm building outside. 6 dairy cows generated their steady heat output while consuming hay and grain that stayed dry and accessible in interior storage areas. The morning milking, feeding, and general livestock care proceeded on schedule while wind drove snow horizontally across the prairie outside. Monday afternoon brought the first of 2 additional blizzards that would follow in rapid succession. Wind speeds increased dramatically, driving snow into drifts that began blocking roads and isolating individual homesteads from their neighbors. The storm was not just dumping precipitation, it was actively redistributing snow through wind action that created barriers 10 to 16 feet high in some locations. Drifts stretched 100 to 200 feet in length, sculpted by prairie wind into formations that made travel impossible for anything less substantial than a railroad locomotive. Muller's situation deteriorated with each hour as the storm intensified. His path to the barn, cleared laboriously that morning, refilled faster than he could maintain it. By evening, feeding time, he faced a choice between heroic effort to reach his animals or allowing them to go hungry until the storm passed. The decision carried consequences either way. Livestock could not survive extended periods without food and water, but the energy cost of battling through drifts might exhaust his own reserves to a dangerous degree. The thermal dynamics of separated buildings revealed their fundamental weakness under extreme conditions. Muller's barn, unheated except for animal body heat, provided minimal protection from wind that found every gap in log construction and drove cold air through spaces that seemed tight during normal weather. His tools froze to metal that became painful to touch. Water buckets developed ice thick enough to prevent animals from drinking. The barn that had seemed adequate during ordinary winter weather became a barely functional space where essential work required tremendous physical effort and careful attention to prevent frostbite. Wettstein's train, meanwhile, had become a mobile laboratory for studying the storm's regional impact. What began as a routine trip from Port Washington to Milwaukee stretched into a 4-day ordeal as locomotives struggled through drifts that blocked tracks faster than crews could clear them. The train carried food for perhaps 6 hours of normal travel, but passengers found themselves rationing supplies and melting snow for drinking water as the journey extended far beyond any reasonable expectation. Progress was measured in miles gained per day, rather than the normal schedule that covered the distance in a few hours. Inside the dwelling stable, operations continued with the steady rhythm that crisis could not disrupt. Gottlieb accessed livestock through interior doors that eliminated exposure to wind capable of driving snow through clothing and stealing body heat faster than physical activity could replace it. The stable area maintained its thermal advantage through the combination of animal heat, shared wall systems with the heated living quarters, and the simple physics of a large interior volume that buffered temperature extremes. Essential equipment remained functional because it never experienced the brutal cold that seized metal tools in unheated buildings. The storm's peak intensity arrived Tuesday and Wednesday as 2 additional blizzard systems rolled across Wisconsin in rapid succession. Wind-driven snow accumulated in drifts that reached heights impossible for individual homesteaders to clear by hand. Roads became impassable, not just from depth, but from the active redistribution of snow that filled cleared areas within hours. Railroad crews, working with the most powerful snow-fighting equipment available, found their locomotives stalled between stations as drifts built faster than mechanical clearing could remove them. Muller's barn had become effectively inaccessible. The animals inside could be heard but not reached without excavation that exceeded the capacity of one man working with hand tools. Each attempt to dig through required enormous physical effort that left him exhausted and dangerously cold. The energy cost of the work approached the limits of what his body could sustain, and the wind refilled his excavation work faster than progress could be maintained. His livestock faced starvation while standing 30 yards from his kitchen window. The contrast with the housebarn operation could not have been more stark. Gottlieb opened interior doors and walked to his animals in still air warmed by their collective body heat. Feeding, watering, and routine care proceeded without interruption because the essential work happened inside a protected envelope that excluded wind entirely. The stable area functioned as a workshop where equipment maintenance, feed preparation, and livestock management continued regardless of conditions outside. Snow could pile 20 feet deep against the exterior walls without affecting the internal operations that kept the farm functioning. Communication and supply lines throughout the region failed as the storm reached full intensity. Telegraph wires, weighted with ice and buffeted by wind, broke connection between communities that suddenly found themselves isolated. The Watertown newspaper would later report that all communication had been cut off and that supplies of essential goods were running low as merchants found themselves unable to receive shipments by rail or road. The storm was testing not just individual homesteads, but the entire infrastructure that connected Wisconsin communities to each other and to outside markets. As the week progressed and the storm's full scope became apparent, neighbors who had spent 30 years mocking Gottlieb's architectural choices began appearing at his door. They came not for advice yet, but because they had run out of other options. The dwelling stable that had seemed like an extravagant waste of timber and labor was now the only farm operation in the township that continued to function normally while everything else ground to a halt in the face of wind and snow that turned simple tasks into life-threatening ordeals. The first neighbors arrived at Gottlieb Lutz's door on Wednesday morning, not with apologies but with desperation. Jakob Muller appeared through snow that reached his chest, exhausted from the trek across what had once been familiar ground between homesteads. His animals had been without feed for 2 days because the barn remained inaccessible, despite repeated attempts to dig through drifts that refilled faster than he could clear them. The mockery that had defined 30 years of community opinion about the house barn was conspicuously absent from the conversation. Muller's request was simple and practical. Could he borrow feed for livestock he could not reach? And did Gottlieb have suggestions for getting through snow that seemed impossible to manage with conventional tools and methods? The question carried weight beyond immediate crisis because it acknowledged what the entire township was learning simultaneously. The separated building approach that had seemed sensible and economical was failing catastrophically under conditions that made every exterior movement a calculated risk. Gottlieb's response reflected the practical German mindset that had guided his construction decisions 3 decades earlier. He did not lecture or gloat about vindication. Instead, he opened his interior doors and showed Muller the protected circulation that allowed essential farm work to continue regardless of weather outside. The demonstration was more powerful than any argument. Morning milking proceeded on schedule, feed remained accessible and dry, tools functioned normally because they never experienced the brutal temperatures that seized metal in unheated buildings. The advice that followed was mechanical rather than philosophical. Move your feed supplies inside heated space if possible. Connect your house to your barn with a covered corridor, even if it means emergency construction during the storm. Stop fighting wind and snow directly. Use interior routes and protected workspaces whenever you can create them. The suggestions were not theoretical but operational, based on methods that had been tested daily for 30 years and proven effective during the crisis that was paralyzing everyone else. By Thursday, the word had spread through the network of neighbors who had managed to reach each other despite blocked roads and impassable conditions. The house barn was not just surviving the blizzard, it was functioning normally while conventional homesteads struggled with basic operations. Farmers who had criticized the excessive timber use and wasteful construction were now asking detailed questions about interior layout, thermal management, and the specific techniques that made protected livestock care possible. The technical explanations Gottlieb provided were precise and instructive rather than defensive. The dwelling stable worked through elimination of wind exposure during essential tasks. The shared wall systems between human and animal spaces allowed thermal energy to moderate temperatures in both areas. The large interior volume buffered extreme temperature swings, while animal body heat provided continuous warming that reduced fuel consumption for the entire operation. The roof system that covered the massive footprint eliminated gaps between buildings where snow could accumulate and block access routes. Construction details that had seemed like European oddities now revealed their practical purpose. The clay nogging between timber frame members sealed air infiltration that would have made interior circulation useless. The careful orientation of the building deflected prevailing winds while positioning doors to minimize drift accumulation. The massive sill beams and proper foundation work had created a structure stable enough to resist the lateral forces of prairie wind, without shifting or developing gaps that would compromise the thermal envelope. The community response shifted from mockery to systematic adoption, but the change was measured in practical modifications rather than dramatic conversions. Farmers began adding lean-to shelters that connected existing buildings, creating covered corridors that eliminated some of the exposure required for daily chores. Others enclosed existing spaces between house and barn, converting open areas into protected work zones that could function during severe weather. The changes were incremental but consistent, driven by the recognition that separated buildings carried hidden costs that became deadly during extreme conditions. August Lutze, now managing the family farm as the second generation, found himself in the position of informal consultant as neighbors sought advice about implementing housebarn principles with existing structures. His approach was pragmatic rather than evangelical. Work with what you have, but eliminate wind exposure wherever possible. Add interior connections between essential buildings. Create protected storage for feed, tools, and fuel that must remain accessible during emergencies. The storm's aftermath provided measurable evidence of the dwelling stable's advantages. Livestock mortality in the township was significantly higher among farms with separated buildings, where animals had been inaccessible during critical feeding periods. Equipment damage was more severe where tools and harnesses had been subjected to extreme temperatures in unheated buildings. Human exhaustion and cold-related injuries occurred primarily among settlers who had been forced to make repeated trips outside during the blizzard conditions. The Lutz operation had sustained no significant losses and required no recovery period to return to normal productivity. The integration that had seemed wasteful proved to be a form of insurance that paid dividends precisely when conventional methods failed most completely. The house barn had not just survived the crisis, it had maintained operational capacity while everything else shut down. Regional newspapers, once the storm had passed and communication was restored, documented the event as a watershed that changed building practices throughout Wisconsin's German settlement areas. The Watertown editor noted that farmers were increasingly connecting their buildings with covered passages and seeking advice about integrated designs that could function during severe weather. The storm had provided a natural experiment that sorted effective from ineffective approaches to frontier architecture. The National Register of Historic Places would eventually recognize the Lutze House Barn in 1884 as nationally significant for its architectural and agricultural importance, acknowledging that this rare American example of European house barn construction had demonstrated superior functionality during documented extreme weather events. The building that had been dismissed as backward thinking was now preserved as an example of practical engineering that solved real problems through traditional knowledge applied to frontier conditions. In the years following the Big Snow of '81, at least 7 similar house barns were documented in Wisconsin's German settlement areas, concentrated where immigrants had maintained connections to old country building traditions. The storm had provided the crisis necessary to overcome American prejudices against mixed-use agricultural buildings and validate construction methods that prioritize function over conventional appearance. Gottlieb Lutze lived to see his architectural choices vindicated not through argument but through measurable performance during the crisis that tested every homestead in the region. The dwelling stable had proven its worth in the most decisive way possible, by continuing to work when everything else failed. On a February morning in 1881, a man could still open an interior door, step into still air, and continue the essential work of farming while the wind piled snow against walls he no longer needed to cross.